In this lecture, we're going to be covering small group communication. And in where a lot of the lessons and a lot of the content that we've covered this semester really looks at dyadic, meaning interpersonal or two people having a conversation communication. Small group communication is a different type of context that involves more people. And therefore, there's some really unique and kind of nuanced views and ways of thinking about communication in small group settings. To begin, we should define what is group communication. And basically, it's communication between three or more people with a common goal in which every person can participate with other members. In group communication, there's some sort of goal, whether that goal is to complete a task or be empathetic and provide social support or seek social support from others. There's always some sort of goal, whether that be extremely abstract or very concrete. There's a goal. And for it to be group communication, everybody is involved and participating in that communication. And we can think of things like family, our coworkers, competitive teams that we're on, the extracurricular things that we were involved in school, any kind of like book club or a social support group that we go to. Churches, in many ways, have a bunch of groups, small groups within them. Our social networks, our friends and things like that. All these different types of things can be, all these different types of entities can be considered groups. And what's important to highlight when it comes to small groups is there's a common identity, meaning we identify with our groups, and group members identify with other members of a particular group. And we understand who we are and who others are based on the groups in which we and others belong to. So we'll talk about that to an extent as well. So what are some characteristics of small groups? First, let's talk about the size, and then we'll talk a little bit about structure. A small group, there's no official high number, but it's got to be at least three, and for me around 15. Any more than 15, it's not really a small group anymore. It's more of an organization. And small groups are often sized, or the size is dictated by the task at hand. In like a private industry, there might be some kind of task force that's put together to try to solve some new kind of, I don't know, maybe how to market a new product. And we will put together a task force of multiple marketers from multiple departments. We'll make it a group of about 10 people, and we want to come up with a new strategy. Well, that kind of group might require a different size group than, let's say, a nonprofit organization that only has 10 to 12 employees. But they want to figure out how to, fix maybe it's a dog washing nonprofit, and one of their dog washers is broken, and they need two or three people to kind of brainstorm, or three or four people to brainstorm and figure out how to fix that. So different kind of tasks. And then think of like therapy groups, maybe, groups like Alcoholics Anonymous. A size, less than five probably isn't going to be very productive for those kinds of conversations. But a size more than 20 to 25 might be too big of the group to have those meaningful social support types of conversations regarding alcoholism. So really the size of the group is dictated by what the task or what the purpose of the group is. And then groups are structured in many different ways. We got to look at internal and external influences that structure any group. Internal influence are things like characteristics of the members and how roles are formed. What's my role within this group? External forces or influences are things like the group size that's put together, what the task is that might be assigned to the group, the resources available to the group. Those might vary in a variety of ways. We might not have control over that. We also got to look at our formal networks and our informal networks. Informal networks are basically our defined roles and our responsibilities and how we're connected to people in a formal way. What's our chain of command? What's our hierarchy? What are our titles that separate us in terms of our areas of expertise? And how does that relate to who we communicate about what with? But then there's informal networks too, which are like non-defined roles. And we'll talk about roles towards the end here. But there's roles within groups that aren't necessarily appointed or determined in the beginning. They emerge as the group starts doing things. Somebody that's got a good sense of humor might start becoming like the funny person within the group, and they're the ones that kind of provide the comic relief and things like that. And then also just different types of interpersonal relationships form within groups that aren't necessarily like, Bob and Sarah, you're going to end up being friends by the time you're done with this group. It's not a formal appointment. It's just people get to know each other and they get to, they gravitate towards other people and bond. And then we also got to look at reachability. And basically, the structure of any group dictates the communication flow and who can talk to who and how easy it is to talk to somebody and how information is disseminated amongst the group. And to look at reachability, this is just an image that'll kind of depict it. We can look at purple person in the middle here. They have a lot of direct reachability to a lot of people. They have a lot of direct contacts, right? But then if you look over here into somebody like orange person, green person, blue person on this end, they're two people removed, right? Purple's got to go to red, and then red's got to talk to blue. Or purple's got to go to red, and then red has to talk to green, or purple's got to go to red, talk to yellow, so on and so forth. But reachability is the degrees of separation between people. And so if person purple has something really important to share with his team or share with the group, it's going to be really easy to directly reach to these people that are all direct contacts, but that information is going to have to be disseminated through person red in order to get to all this other information, or it gets all these other people. Now, say person green has something really important they need to tell person purple, or even person orange way over here on the opposite end of the chart. There's a few direct lines of communication that are going to take place, and that's important because it just affects our time in terms of how quickly messages can get disseminated, the meaning behind those messages in terms of who's sharing them and who they're coming from, so on and so forth, and then just how quickly information is disseminated and how that influences the culture and the climate of the group. Let's go over some more characteristics. Let's talk about interdependence and shared identity. Interdependence, really basic. Any small group means that people rely on each other. Each member shares a common purpose and they have a common fate. We are all relying on each other. We're all depending on each other because we have a common goal and a common purpose. And if we do good or we do bad, that's going to affect all of us at the end. And this is why a lot of students don't like group assignments. We'll talk about social loafing and groupthink and those kinds of things. But a lot of students get into group projects or group assignments and they realize, oh, well, person A and person B, they want to do a really good job. So I can kind of slack and kick back and do nothing because they know that my success is their success and my failure is their failure. A lot of people find themselves in group projects where they're doing a bulk of the work. And that's kind of because people know they can get away with it because there's that common fate. But shared identity is really key when it comes to groups. And really, when we talk about our identity on a more broad, abstract level, there's a lot of theorists that believe identity is solely comprised of the groups that we belong to. And if you think about it, it makes sense, right? If somebody asks you, if some stranger were to walk up to you and say, "Who are you?" what would your answers be? First, it would be your name, something like that, right? But then, how would you describe yourself if somebody said, "Okay, I know your name's Nate, but how would you describe yourself? What do you do? What are your hobbies?" I'd say things like I'm a professor. I like to read. I like to play basketball. I like sports. I like riding motorcycles. I'd say all these things that associate me with these different types of groups of people that do very similar activities. And so when we look at small group communication, we look at how groups are identities in themselves. They come up with a vision statement or mission statements that describes exactly what they do and what their purpose is. We come up with things like group names and slogans and symbols. Think of any kind of organization or any kind, any kind of business or anything like that. We come up with these things so that people can identify who we are and what our group is. And then we look at this idea of in-group and out-group identity. And at the very basic core of this, in-group identity is an identity that belongs to people that are a part of the group, and it separates in-group members from out-group members. So a real basic kind of example like this is if two football teams are squaring off against each other, Those football teams are wearing different color uniforms. They're comprised of different members. They have different team names. They just have a completely different identity as a team. And so it's easy for us to distinguish who the in group is for one team, who the in group is for the other team, and thus it allows us to understand who the out group members are for both teams. We don't identify with that other team. I'm a Mustang. I'm not a Buffalo or whatever your, team mascots might be, but in a basic sense, that's just how we distinguish ourselves and understand who we are individually. There are rules and norms in groups. Again, thinking of norms as quote unquote the way things are done around here. There's social rules and norms. There's rules and norms about how we interact, how we talk, how we just communicate with one another. There's rules and norms about procedures, how we get things done, or not how we get things done, but how we do particular operations. What's our order of operations? How are decisions made? And then there's rules and norms on tasks, like how groups actually get things done, combining those things. And then there's roles. There's formal roles that are assigned. You're the manager, you're the secretary, you're the treasurer, or you're the point guard, you're the shooting guard, you're the center, or you play saxophone, you play percussion, you play flute, whatever it might be. There's formal assigned kind of things, but then there's informal kind of roles that emerge, like, oh, you're the funny guy, or you're the serious person, or oh, you're the synthesizer, you bring everybody together. There's informal roles that emerge as the group starts doing group stuff. And these things focus on task. Informal roles can be task related, where they help you reach goals. They can be social related, where it helps group relationships, it helps improve relationships. But then there's also dysfunctional informal roles that are really just roles that work counterproductively to what the purpose of the team is, like the social loafer or the aggressor who's just always mad and pissed off and being a jerk. Different types of roles emerge, both formally and informally, and some are good and some are bad. And so when we think about the functions of small groups, or why we join them, or why they exist in the first place, there's really three reasons why small groups exist, or why we form small groups, or why we join groups. It's for instrumental needs, interpersonal needs, and identity needs. And instrumental needs are about getting stuff done. It's easy to think about instrumental needs being met through groups in the workplace, right? I've mentioned things like task force, or committees, or subcommittees. Things like that are formed in the workplace all the time, where you put a bunch of different people together and it's say, hey, get this thing done. We need to figure this problem out so we can continue to do our jobs. We can continue to operate as an organization or as a business, or we can do this better, whatever it might be. We got to look at stuff and get stuff done. We got to figure out how to complete tasks. Or it's about think tanking, getting information to a larger base to which the group belongs. Again, thinking of a business, let's get together, let's focus on this one particular item and then disseminate that information out to everybody else in the organization. It's things like providing service to members, advocating for change. Think of things like labor unions and stuff, advocating for change, providing information. This is, think of like academic journal committees who are reviewing journals and disseminating that information. Um, so on and so forth. But ultimately, at the end of the day, in some degree, usually groups have some sort of instrumental need. There's very few types of groups that don't have some type of instrumental need, where there's something that needs to be completed, or a task at hand, or information that needs to be shared. There's usually some sort of instrumental thing that has to happen. But we also form groups for more interpersonal needs. These are groups that allow us to feel a part of something, and they give us a sense of inclusion, a sense of control, a sense of social support. These are things like, joining the local, like joining a book club if you want to make new friends, or, playing pickup basketball with a group of buddies on Wednesday nights, or, getting together and like knitting, or really any, even social support groups, families that have experienced cancer or alcoholism or drug abuse, survivors of rape and things like that. Sometimes we have these interpersonal needs that are best well met through different types of groups. We like to feel a social bond. We like to feel connected to other people and a part of something that's bigger than us that other people are also into. We like having control over decision making with stuff. We like being a part of groups that influence outcomes, especially if it's really relevant to our lives. If there's something going on in our community, maybe it's about, like, say, for instance, there's a new proposal on the ballot regarding tax increases or something like that. Well, maybe you want to be a part of a strategic group that gets together and focuses on why those taxes are going up, and then we'll disseminate that information to the group. We join groups to be controlled. It sounds weird, but sometimes we join groups because we don't want to be the sole decision maker or the leader, and we like being assigned roles and tasks and responsibilities. We also join groups because we're drawn to the group and see it as a source of support. Again, like a therapy group for cancer survivors and their spouses or something like that. So groups, yes, groups are formed to complete stuff and get stuff done, and get stuff done more effectively than if we just had individuals doing it on the individual level. But we also form groups for interpersonal needs, things that are more relationally based and not task focused. And then finally, as I've mentioned before, group meets our identity needs. The groups we belong to really do equate to our identity in a lot of ways. Again, thinking about, like, me as an individual, I'm a male, so I belong to that group. I went to a particular high school, so I identify with that group. I grew up in a particular town, I identify with that group. I was an athlete. I played basketball. Really, any of the ways we think about our identity, we can kind of think of how we belong to these larger groups. And so one thing that I encourage you to do is just take 5 minutes and write down the groups you belong to. Think of it, based on what we've learned about groups this far. Write down as many groups you belong to. And then think about how these groups you belong to impact your identity and your self-concept, and thus, how does that maybe relate to your communication and your perception and the things that we've learned thus far this semester? And another thing about groups is they exist on a continuum. We've talked, about I've mentioned a few times now, task and relationship. All groups have these elements, and they really exist on a continuum. Some groups are way more task-oriented, small groups. These are groups that are formed to solve a problem, promote a cause, generate ideas. Communication is centered on the final product or outcome. We're really focused on productivity and that final widget that we're going to create. That's what's most important to us. It's not about what's going on in your personal life. It's not about us all getting along and being buddies. It's about getting shit done. We look at production. We usually produce something tangible. The discussion, it's a lot of talk through and exploring ideas, and it's problem solving. We develop a course of action to meet a specific need. So that's one end of the spectrum. On the other end of the spectrum, you have groups that are more relationally oriented. And these are groups that are formed to promote interpersonal connections and focus more on the well being of group members. So, thinking about that spectrum, so over here is task, over here is relational. A focus group for some, like Alcoholics Anonymous or cancer survivors or victims of rape, something like that. That's going to be way more on the relational oriented side of the spectrum. Now, say Kellogg is introducing a new cereal and they need their marketing department to come up with a new fantastic marketing idea. That's going to be way more on the task side of the spectrum in terms of how that group operates. So just kind of know that there's this spectrum, this continuum with task on one side and relational on the other, and all groups exist somewhere on that continuum. It's just some are further on one side of that continuum than the others, depending on the purpose and why that group exists in the first place. And then we can look at primary groups and secondary groups. Primary groups are our long-standing groups, and these are formed based on relationships and include significant others. These aren't groups that we're really forced into as much as ones that have a strong relational element. And we interact most frequently with these groups, and they have heavy influence, this is important, on how society is shaped and how individuals develop their conception of reality. So groups play a huge role in how we come to, you grow up, we're not all religious, or we don't all ascribe to the same religion. And why is that? In most cases, people identify with the religion that they were brought up on and raised on within their family. So things like that, any of our values, belief systems, so on and so forth, these are really strongly formed within those very, very powerful primary groups of people that we belong to, like our families and our kinships and things like that. Secondary groups are a little bit further removed. They're a little bit less emotional and relational communication. It focuses a little bit more on task. This is like our social groups, our extracurricular groups, hobbies, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, yeah, of course, there's relational elements to groups like that, but we're there for more than just a let's talk about our beliefs and our value systems and our core, beliefs as a human. I'm here for some sort of reason, whether it's something fun I want to do or something I want to accomplish, whatever. There's more of a reason. So go back to your list and just quickly identify which of your groups you think are primary and which of your groups you think are secondary. Really quickly, I'm going to breeze through small group development. One thing that I'll strongly encourage you all to do is get on YouTube and just Google, or get on YouTube and YouTube search, that is, small group communication or small group development, or the stages, or the developmental stages of small group. There's really cool examples using things like the Avengers. Remember the Titans, one of the most classic football movies ever. You can look at it through like Google as an organization. There's really whatever example most floats your boat. There's a million different videos out there that do a really, really good job of breaking down group development and provide more context. So please go out on YouTube, find your own video of small group development. It'll put it in more context for you so you can see it and understand it better. But there's basically 5 stages. There's forming. This is when the group first comes together and you're just getting to feel things out. You're getting to know the climate. You're kind of getting to know people. You're starting to form impressions of other people in the group. You're starting to understand the climate of the group a little bit better. Things are just getting started. Storming is where the ball starts rolling. Ideas start emerging, conflicts start happening, and individuals start negotiating kind of where they fit in the group, what their role kind of is within this group, both formally and informally, kind of who am I and what's my purpose here. Norming is where the practices and the expectations of the group are solidified. You can think of it as like the tone for what group members ought to do and what they are expected to do become known. We start to learn what kind of words are acceptable to use, what kind of phrases are okay, what kind of jokes are acceptable, just what kind of energy should I be bringing to the table. We really just start to learn the norms of the group. Performing is where finally we're ready to start doing stuff. Let's achieve our purpose. Let's accomplish our task. Let's get it done. And then adjourning is the end piece. This is when the group disbands, or it's repurposed, or it's reformed. Interpersonal relationships often remain after the group adjourns. But these are the 5 primary stages: forming, storming, norming, performing, and adjourning. And like I said, I strongly encourage you to go find a YouTube video that demonstrates this. It's really cool to see it in action within a context that you're most interested in. Let's talk a little bit about some small group dynamics. Communication, as I mentioned in the very beginning, is really, really unique in small group settings compared to interpersonal settings because it's got so many different interpersonal relationships within one group. We got to consider the group climate. This is the relatively kind of tone and the quality of the group. And it's different in group settings compared to dyads. There's a different type of tone because there's a lot of different interpersonal things happening. So this whole thing kind of comprises to make a group climate. And group climate is strongly related to task cohesion and social cohesion. And again, task is really looking at the commitment of the group members to the purposes and the activity of the group. That's what's our purpose? Why am I here? Why am I a part of this group? What's our end goal? What's our outcome? But then the social cohesion is looking at more at the interpersonal relationships within the group. How is there attraction and liking among groups members? And both of these things combine to play a strong impact. Both the task component and the social/relational component really are what make up group climate. And how to really enhance a good group climate is looking at symbolic convergence. And this refers to the sense of community or group consciousness that develops in a group. And this really happens through non task related communication. This is the cooler talk, the offline conversations, the not the conversations we're having at the board meeting. And it leads to what's called group fantasies, which sounds kind of weird, but group fantasies really just gets at the events that are outside of the here and now, right? So not the conversations focused on, okay, we're looking at the task, today's meeting, we're going to focus on this. That conversation during today's meeting is not what creates group fantasies. You create kind of a narrative and a fantasy of the group by talking about things in the past or predicting the future or talking about things that aren't even relevant to your group, about other people or events outside of the group. It creates symbolic convergence. It creates this type of community or this sense of group, this sense of belonging that might not exist if you're solely focused on the task at all times. And socializing group members is a huge role in creating these types of communities and this type of sense of belonging that we all want. If you go, a quick little movie right here, again, if you've seen Mean Girls, you'll be familiar with it. But YouTube Mean Girls group socialization is a quick little movie, 4 or 5 minute video that really shows what socialization is and depicts it. But group socialization is really when somebody new comes into the group. It's the process of teaching and learning the norms, the rules, and expectations of the group and what the expectations of your behavior are. And socialization happens in a lot of different ways, right? If it's a group that's been around forever and it's a new person that's joining the group, yeah, we gotta teach that new person the rules. Or at times a group member might start, going astray or start doing things that don't really fit into the norms of the group. We'll kind of have those conversations to re-socialize that individual. And again, both socialization does both. It looks at the technical now. It socializes people to the technical knowledge, the task related stuff. Like these are the skills and the information you need to complete the tasks. But it also looks at the social and the relational side of things too. These are the norms of interaction and how to act and how to behave. And both of these things happen and take place at the same time. And they happen differently depending on the status of the group. Like I said, whether it's a long standing group or a new group. If it's a new group and everybody's coming together, we're all socializing each other all at the same time and coming up with norms. Other groups that have been around have pre-existing norms and rules. But go ahead, check out Mean Girls group socialization. It'll show you basically how the lead character right there comes to a new school and she's being socialized into the Plastics, a group led by Rachel McAdams, the mean girls of the high school. And she wants to be a plastic and know what it's all about. So she goes through socialization steps to learn what it's like and what it takes to be a plastic. So, moving on to conformity, groupthink, and conflict. We've talked about socialization and norms and rules and things like that. Well, how do these things maintain and how do they stay? Once a group climate's kind of created, how does that stay? Basically, that's when conformity happens. When a group reaches a place where the members accept the rules and the norms, that's conformity. And there's often a reward or punishment system of some sort to ensure conformity. Like if you do these things well enough, you'll get a reward. If you do these things poorly enough, there'll be some kind of punishment or coercion associated with it. And so conformity pressure is good. Like it's good for groups to pressure their members to conform to the rules and the norms of the group to a certain extent, but you don't want it to go too far, like hazing rituals in, different types of sororities and fraternity houses and things like that. Those conformity pressure activities can sometimes get people killed. So conformity pressure, it's good, but it's got to be thought of the right way. But the thing is, we don't want to conform too much because it results in groupthink. Groupthink is basically just where people lose their individual critical thinking skills because everybody is just so close and cool and conformed to everything. There's just such a high level of cohesion and such a high level of conformity that you're not producing good stuff anymore. You're not doing good things. You're not having good conversations. You're not making new, nuanced, advanced products because ideas have been dwarfed. Everybody just agrees with everybody. Everybody gets along with everybody. Everybody's just a good time. So there's really no productivity. So what we want is conflict. Conflict in groups is good, but it's all about the intensity of the conflict and the steps taken to create a positive outcome. We want people with different thoughts. We want people with different ideas and approaches to things in small group settings because that diversity of thought is what leads to the best outcomes. But we don't want conflict to get to the point where people are at each other's throats and can't stand each other. So, how do we do that? Well, first, what we need to do is identify the different types of conflict. There's three main kinds. There's procedural conflict, and this is about the how. This gets at when group members are in disagreement about how to do something. You know, we can eliminate the ice on the driveway by either shoveling it or putting salt on it. You know, maybe there's a disagreement in the group for that. And it's a process. It's not about what the outcome is. It's about getting to that outcome. There's different procedural and process agreements, right? And oftentimes, you know, how do we fix this? Leadership decisions can sometimes just say, no, we're doing it this way. And then everybody's like, ah, whatever, let's move on. You can have group votes or motions from the groups. There's a lot of different ways to kind of solve procedural conflicts. There's substantive conflicts. This is when group members disagree on the purpose or the task of the group itself. This is if a group is together, you know, again, if we're talking about Alcoholics Anonymous, which is a support therapy group for alcoholics to help keep them, you know, straight and sober. But then somebody in the group comes in and says, ah, screw it, we should all go back to drinking. And then slowly that becomes a new, you know, kind of a new, you know, thought in the group, like, yeah, drinking is fine, whatever. Well, that somebody would stand up and say, no, like this is not the purpose of our group at all. We are here because we're alcoholics and we shouldn't be drinking, period. I don't know why we started changing our way of thinking. So that's like an example of that type of conflict. And how do we fix this? Open discussions, further research to improve credibility in one's argument, and how do we find common ground and common agreement based on that? And then interpersonal conflict is really just when there's relationship problems within a group. This is when individual members experience conflict for relational purposes with relational individual others. Maybe there's just somebody that's super arrogant, you can't stand listening to them. Maybe you're really, really attracted to one of your group members and you want to date them, and that becomes a problem. So how do we do this? Remember perception checking, right? We need to check our perceptions and make sure we're on the same page as other people and not just assume and make judgments without having credible evidence. Open dialogue, having conversations about these different types of agreements. This type of communication can help us with these different types of conflicts. And overall, when it comes to any conflict, we circle back to our core of communication competence, clarify issues, and provide historical context on them on why they're issues. Practice perception checking. Create positive discussion climates, which include active listening skills, which we've covered, right? Being a strong, active listener creates strong communication environments. Discuss needs. Right? Don't always focus on solutions. Don't always be solution oriented. But what are the needs of the group? Discuss boundaries. You know, what are the boundaries that we should have within our conversations? And try to use we language and be inclusive when interacting with people in a group. So let's talk a little bit about leadership roles and problem solving in groups. First, leadership. Leadership is a complex set of beliefs, communication patterns, and behaviors that influence the functioning of a group and move a group towards the completion of a task, right? And when we think about leadership, there's two ways that leadership presents itself. Leaders are either designated, meaning they're like handpicked, or they're appointed, or they're elected, or they're hired, or they're promoted. There's some sort of formal recognition that designates them for that role. But then there's also emergent leadership, which means leaders emerge and by gaining status and respect through the engagement they have with groups. And they're looked at a leader and they're looked at to others as a resource for leadership when things are needed. So this isn't somebody that's officially, hired as the manager or hired as the boss or elected as the government official or appointed as the, whatever it might be. This is just a group member that through their interactions, through their engagement, just through their ability of being a good group member, they start to be viewed and they start to emerge as a leader. So there's a lot of different theorizing that's gone on over the years in terms of how leaders are leaders. What makes a leader? What makes an individual leader? And I'll say that I think all three of these are relevant, but I think you got to understand um, um, a little bit about the first two to know how the third one works. So traits. I mean, they're the traditional theorizing on leadership was there's just people that are born with it. Certain people are born with physical appearances, communication abilities. Some people are more intelligent than others. Some people have better personality than others. Some people are just born with traits that make them a leader. Do I agree that there are certain traits that help people become better leaders? Yes. Do I think that some people are born with traits and have a better, starting point than others with those traits? Yes. But do I think that traits are stagnant, meaning that other people can't develop those traits and acquire those traits? No. So I do think that traits play a big role in leadership, but I don't think that traits are static, meaning you are born with traits and that's it. People are born leaders or they're not. That's it. I don't buy that. There's more of a situational approach, which I also buy into this to a certain extent. There are situations that provide opportunity for leaders to simply emerge. Certain things happen, certain shifts and dynamics take place where somebody has an opportunity to kind of show up and step up as a leader, and it happens. Yeah, I do believe that to an extent that there is situational leadership. But what I really look at when it comes to leadership is how communication skills and competence can create leadership. Um, Basically, this kind of approach gets at the idea that there are particular communication behaviors that'll create conditions of leadership. Leadership behaviors can be learned and enacted by anybody, and you need to look at a combination of task, procedural, and relational functions of leadership. You got to make sure that you're getting tasks done. You need to come up with the right processes that work for everybody to get those tasks done. And you need a healthy relational environment within your groups to be a good communication skilled leader. And this allows for emergent leadership and shared leadership, meaning that leadership doesn't just have to be one individual at all times. So these three traits, situation, and communication skill and competence are kind of the three overarching ways of viewing leadership. And down towards the bottom is more of what we align with and think about today. It's a leader's ability to develop and learn communication skills and functions that make them a strong leader. And we can combine different aspects of looking at what groups need in order to function properly, to really be a good leader. And leadership can emerge and it can be shared amongst multiple people from this perspective. And then to go a little bit further, there's just different leadership categories. People are naturally just sort of different when it comes to leadership. And or I guess that's not even the best way to say it. A better way to say it, there are different approaches to quote unquote being a leader. There's different styles that people gravitate towards when they're in their leadership mode. And really at the end of the day, the best leaders can be all of these leaders. Best leaders can be different types of leaders depending on the relational and situational context. The directive leaders are kind of your classic authoritarian kind of figures like the manager. They like to give orders, they like to set expectations, they're looking at the bottom line. Sometimes they can be kind of jerks or bullies. I'm not saying that all the characteristics of this type of leadership are good, but sometimes these are good leadership styles, especially for new groups that are just starting to figure things out. New companies, new organizations, so on and so forth. There's participative leadership styles, and these are kind of like the synthesizer, if you will. Participative leaders are all about everybody's voice being heard, everybody engaging in stuff, everybody being present, everybody just being involved with things, right? There's the supportive leader, And the supportive leader tends to be like the climate setter, if you ask me. It's the person that really focuses on the relationship elements way more than the task elements. It's all about everybody getting along and having fun. It's not so much about getting things done or completing tasks or meeting due dates and things like that. It's about let's just enjoy each other and have a good time. And the achievement oriented leader, this is kind of the apex of leadership. This is kind of combining a bunch of different leadership styles into the ultimate leadership form. This is somebody that inspires, they lead by example, they're held at a high level of regard, people like them, they involve people in decision making, they're transformative. The achievement oriented leaders, they get stuff done, they get it done in a way people like. They have good relationships with their constituents, and people just like them. So, again, at the end of the day, there's a lot of different leadership styles, but the best leadership is an individual that can use different leadership styles and adapt their leadership style depending on context. And with leadership comes power. Briefly go through this, the different types of power. There's legitimate power. That's the stuff that comes with your title. CEO, that gives you legitimate power. Director of, that gives you legitimate power. Manager, that's legitimate power. It's in your title, it's in your officially held title, your official status. There's expert power, which is the knowledge that you have gives you power. If you're a scientist and maybe you don't want to necessarily be a leader, but you got brought into some kind of task force group and you're the expert when it comes to a particular molecular modeling of some sort, you have power because you're the smartest one at the table. There's referent power, which literally just refers to the degree to which people like you will be the degree to which you have power. A lot of people have power just in the sense that they are social, they're fun, and people are just drawn to them and like them. They like their personality. Information power really gets to how many people you know, what resources you have access to compared to others. The more people you know, the more connections you have, the more resources you have, you're a sense of informative power. And then the least favorite for me is reward slash coercion power. And what this gets at is you have the ability to give somebody something or take something away. You have the ability to give them a raise or you have the ability to fire them. That is also a form and type of power. So really quickly, I'm going to breeze through group member roles, but definitely read this in your textbook in more extent. But really what this just gets at is in groups, different informal roles kind of emerge based on personality characteristics and different dynamics. Here's a list of some of the task roles. Again, pause this if you want to read it. Pause the video if you want to read it, but definitely read through your textbook. You got your opinion giver, somebody that states their beliefs or opinions. You have somebody that's kind of the diagnostician. They indicate what the problems are and they like to look at the problems and point those out. There's the energizer, the person that's kind of like, come on, gang, rah, rah, let's keep doing it. Secretary, they keep notes of the group's progress. There's a lot of different task roles that are relevant and emerge within group dynamics. Along with task roles, there's also maintenance or social types of roles like the harmonizer, the person that reconciles disagreements, they mediate differences, they reduce tension among people. There's the gatekeeper, they keep communication channels open, they encourage communication across different types of systems. There's the follower, they go along with the movement of the group passively, they accept ideas of others. There's different types of relational maintenance social roles. So again, task roles and maintenance or social or relational roles, both of these emerge as groups start doing group stuff. And then finally, there's some dysfunctional roles that just aren't good, like the aggressor. They struggle for status and always want to boast and sound cool. There's the joker, somebody that's always screwing around. Definitely get familiar with the dysfunctional roles in your textbook. These are things that we want to avoid and not have emerge in our groups. And then finally, I just want to briefly breeze over the group problem solving process. It's pretty easy to see this on the surface, but when a problem emerges in a group, try to avoid the petty arguments, try to avoid the unnecessary, blame game or just, petty conversations. First, define the problem as a group. Consider the current undesirable situation, look at what our goal is or how can what do we want to be as a more desirable situation, and then what is the obstacle in our way of getting to that. Next thing, you analyze the problem. Don't start coming up with solutions. Don't start spitballing how we fix things. Just analyze the problem in depth as much as you possibly can. From there, the group should generate as many possible solutions as they can. Everybody is encouraged to generate solutions. How do we fix this? How do we move forward? Give me all of your thoughts. Then, as a group, you evaluate all of the solutions. You evaluate everything that's been said, everything that's been shared, and arrive at the solution that you want best. And then finally, what you do is implement and assess the solution that you chose. So, a lot going on with small group communication. Definitely be familiar with how groups are formed and their development. Definitely be familiar with leadership styles, and be familiar with power. Familiarize yourself with the different types of formal and informal roles that emerge within groups. Understand the groups are both task oriented or relationally oriented, and know a lot of the basic characteristics and dynamics of small group communication. There's a lot when it comes to small group communication, so definitely make sure you have a thorough understanding of everything in your text and also in our lecture here.